Number 9. Plymouth Duster. The Plymouth Duster in 1972 was at the commercial peak of its A-body compact run, the fastback coupe that Chrysler had introduced in 1970 on the Valiant platform with the 225 cubic inch slant-six engine that Chrysler had been inclined 30 degrees from vertical since 1960 to improve its oil distribution geometry, and at a price that the compact buyer in 1972 could reach without financing terms that made the monthly payment the primary number in the conversation. It sold over 240,000 units in 1972, making it one of the best-selling domestic compacts in the country, and the car that Plymouth dealers were using to answer every customer who walked in asking about an economy car that was not a Pinto and not a Vega. Its 225 slant-six gave the Duster buyer the documented reliability that the Vega's aluminum block was simultaneously failing to establish in the same market segment. Its fastback roofline communicated youth without requiring the insurance premium that the Plymouth Cuda or the Dodge Challenger had been charging for the same aspiration before the muscle car segment's insurance economics had made those cars increasingly difficult for their target buyer to afford. The Duster is at number 9 because over 240,000 Americans chose the compact Plymouth on a proven 12-year-old engine architecture, the correct compact argument in a year when the incorrect one was being documented in Chevrolet dealer service records. Number 8. Chevrolet Nova. The Chevrolet Nova in 1972 was selling in the specific commercial context that made its sales figure more interesting than its advertising. The Chevrolet Vega, which occupied the entry-level compact position in the same Chevrolet dealer's lot, had been Motor Trend's Car of the Year in 1971 and had been generating service department documentation since 1971 that the Motor Trend Award had not anticipated and could not revise. The Nova's inline-six and small block V8 options, its conventional front-engine rear-wheel drive layout, and the mechanical simplicity that any independent shop in any American county could service gave the compact Chevrolet buyer who had stood in the Chevrolet dealer's lot and looked at both options a reason to choose the one that had not been winning awards recently. The Nova sold over 350,000 units in 1972, a number significantly larger than the Vega's sales in the same year from the same dealer, in direct competition with the car that had received the most significant editorial endorsement in American automotive journalism 12 months earlier. The Nova is at number 8 because in 1972, the compact Chevrolet that had not been named Car of the Year was outselling the compact Chevrolet that had, and because the mechanism that produced that result was the same one that has always resolved such competitions. The mechanic's recommendation passed to the customer about to make a decision.
Number 7. Ford Pinto. The Ford Pinto in 1972 was doing exactly what it was supposed to do, selling to the young American buyer who needed personal transportation on a limited budget at a price below $2,000 in base configuration, in a market where the alternative from General Motors was the Chevrolet Vega, whose reputation for reliability was being actively constructed in service departments across the country. The Pinto sold in the hundreds of thousands in 1972 as the affordable domestic subcompact that Ford had positioned to compete with the Volkswagen Beetle, lighter, more stylish than the Beetle in the American aesthetic, and powered by a 1.6 or 2.0-liter four-cylinder that delivered fuel economy that the Impala buyer had not been asked to think about yet. Ford's internal engineering documents, produced in connection with the fuel tank's placement, existed in 1972. They would not become public knowledge for another 5 years when Mother Jones magazine reported on them in 1977. In 1972, the Pinto was simply the affordable compact that young Americans bought when they needed transportation, could not stretch to a Nova, and had decided the Volkswagen Beetle's air-cooled engine was someone else's preference. Number 6. Pontiac Bonneville. The Pontiac Bonneville in 1972 was the full-size Pontiac that the American family, which had reached a specific income threshold, chose to make the fact of having reached it visible from the street.
Its 400 or 455-inch cubic inch V8, its turbo-hydromatic automatic, and its standard power accessory list communicated the full-size American luxury experience at a Pontiac price. From the division that sat between Chevrolet and Buick in the General Motors hierarchy, which meant the Bonneville occupied the exact price point at which personal aspiration and practical affordability were most commercially concentrated in the American automotive market of 1972. Its formal roofline, its Pontiac's signature quad headlights, and the available bucket seat and center console configuration in the Granville trim gave the Bonneville buyer the visual identity that the neighbor watching from across the driveway could accurately interpret. A decision made from a position of sufficient income rather than maximum necessity.
Number 5. Chevrolet Chevelle. The Chevrolet Chevelle in 1972 was in its last year as the classic A-body midsize that Chevrolet had introduced in 1964. The platform that had produced the Chevelle SS396, the LS6 454, and the most commercially successful muscle car body in the American market. For 1973, the Chevelle would move to the Colonnade platform that changed its proportions, its roofline, and its relationship to the performance equipment that the pre-1973 buyer had been ordering. In 1972, the buyer who understood the redesign was coming chose the known configuration in the pattern that farewell seasons reliably produce. The SS option, available with 350 or 454 cubic inch V8, gave the buyer who still wanted the full muscle car experience an option that the insurance actuaries had made expensive but not yet impossible. Its Malibu trim gave the buyer who needed the mid-size practical argument the same body in a configuration that the family with 2 car seats and a budget for fuel could justify. The Chevelle is at number 5 because in 1972, the last year of the classic A-body configuration that had defined Chevrolet's mid-size lineup for 8 years, the car that was leaving in its known form sold to buyers who understood they were purchasing it for the last time. And because 1972 was also the last year the buyer could order a 454 cubic inch mid-size Chevrolet without the compromises that 1973's emissions requirements and insurance adjustments would impose. Number 4. Ford LTD. The Ford LTD in 1972 accomplished something that requires repetition to appreciate. It was among the 3 best-selling passenger cars in the United States in 1972, in the final year before the oil embargo made fuel economy the primary automotive conversation in America, and it has generated so few memorable stories about the year it dominated that recalling its sales figures requires research rather than memory. Its 6-passenger bench seat, its Cruise-O-Matic automatic, and its 351 or 400 cubic inch V8 options gave the American family that had decided on full size and decided on Ford exactly the car those 2 decisions produced at the Ford dealer nearest their address for a price that the family budget in 1972, before the inflation of the middle part of the decade, could absorb without the financing conversation lasting longer than the test drive. The LTD is at number 4 because in 1972, the 3rd best-selling passenger car in America was a car that the American family chose with the same practical logic it had applied to full-size domestic sedans for 20 years: room, reliability, accessibility, and a dealer within 20 miles of their address. And because the last year that logic operated without the fuel cost variable that October 1973 would permanently install, is the last year the full-size Ford sales figure looks unremarkable rather than like evidence of a world that no longer exists. Number 3. Volkswagen Beetle. In 1972, the Volkswagen Beetle's cumulative global production surpassed the Ford Model T's all-time record of 15,007,033 units, the most durable production record in automotive history, set by the car that had defined affordable personal transportation for the first generation of American automobile owners.
The Beetle had done it with a 60-horsepower air-cooled engine, a heater that automotive journalists described charitably as optimistic about its capabilities, and a sales argument that had not changed since 1938, that simplicity, reliability, and a price that the first-time buyer could reach were worth the absence of the horsepower, the chrome, and the displacement that Detroit had decided were the only automotive values the American market would recognize. In 1972, the Beetle was selling over 340,000 units annually in the American market, more than any foreign nameplate it sold before in consecutive years. The record it surpassed had stood for 45 years. The car that set it had built the American automobile industry. The car that broke it had been designed before the Second World War, with an engine in the trunk and a heater whose relationship to warmth was primarily aspirational. The Beetle is at number 3 because in 1972 it broke the most significant production record in automotive history, and no American automotive journalist treated it as the story of the year because the Impala was selling 1 million copies and nobody was counting. Number 2. Dodge Dart. The Dodge Dart in 1972 had been making its reliability argument since 1963. 9 years of slant-six ownership documentation accumulated through the mechanic who recommended it to the next customer, the neighbor who described 100,000 miles without an engine rebuild, the coworker who had compared their maintenance cost to the Vega owner in the adjacent parking space and found the comparison resolved without ambiguity. The slant-six's 30-degree inclination from vertical, a geometry that had been serving its oil distribution requirements since 1960, had by 1972 produced an ownership record that the compact market's most dramatic entries of the previous 3 years had been validating by contrast. The Dart sold over 300,000 units in 1972, placing it among the most purchased domestic compacts in the country. Its 198 or 225 cubic inch slant-six options and the available 318 cubic inch V8 gave the buyer the compact range that 1972 required. Affordable entry with the slant-six, reasonable performance with the V8, and in both configurations, a mechanical design whose service costs the independent mechanic could quote without consulting anything other than previous experience with previous Darts. The Dart is at number 2 because in 1972, the last year the compact buyer chose without a gasoline price calculation, 300,000 Americans chose the compact with the 9-year reliability record, either by doing the research themselves or by listening to someone who had.
Number 1. Chevrolet Impala. Chevrolet sold more than 1 million full-size automobiles in 1972. In 1972, nobody was performing the fuel economy calculation that would become the primary variable in every American car buying decision made after October 1973. Gas cost approximately 36 cents per gallon. The Impala was available with a 454 cubic inch V8 that produced power in quantities the 55-mile-per-hour national speed limit, which did not yet exist, had not yet made hypothetical. The buyer who chose it was making the same practical decision that American families had been making since the early 1950s. The full-size Chevrolet, at the Chevrolet price, from the Chevrolet dealer that served their county, was the correct answer to the American family transportation problem. Over 1 million of them confirmed that answer in 1972. 13 months later, the Arab oil embargo of October 1973 would make that answer feel like it had been given by people who had not been paying attention to the signals. The signals had existed. The American car market had not been reading them in the way that 13 months of subsequent events would suggest they should have been read. The Impala is at number 1 because in the last year the American full-size buyer chose without a fuel cost calculation, over 1 million of them chose the full-size Chevrolet. And because more than 1 million buyers could not have known they were making their decision, in the last year it could be made exactly that way.